Hello everyone, welcome to 10-Minute Physiology. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the effects of cortisol. So with that, let's give it a go. So before we talk about the effects of cortisol, I first want to go through the cellular signaling pathway that cortisol uses. So inside the blood, 90% of all cortisol is going to be bound to cortisol binding globulin. So cortisol binding globulin is a protein that can bind to cortisol. So what happens is that the cortisol that is bound to the cortisol binding globulin will free itself from the protein, becoming free cortisol. The free cortisol will then diffuse into the cytosol of cells, and once it's in the cytosol of cells, it can interact with its receptor. So inside the cytosol of cells, we have the glucocorticoid receptor. So the glucocorticoid receptor is a receptor that can bind to cortisol. However, the glucocorticoid receptor is going to be bound to another protein called a chaperone protein. And one example of a chaperone protein is HSP90 or heat shock protein 90. So when cortisol comes into the cytosol, the cortisol is able to bind to the glucocorticoid receptor. And when this happens, this causes HSP90 and the glucocorticoid receptor cortisol complex to dissociate from each other. So after this dissociation takes place, the glucocorticoid receptor cortisol complex will move into the nucleus, where it will modulate the transcription of certain genes. And it does this by binding to glucocorticoid response elements on DNA. Now, in order for the glucocorticoid receptor to exert its effects on transcription, the glucocorticoid receptor must make a homodimer with another glucocorticoid receptor. And after this dimer forms, the dimers are then able to modulate the transcription of certain genes. So this is how cortisol exerts its effects in cells. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look and see the different effects of cortisol that we can see in our body. Now the list that we're going to go through today is not comprehensive, but I'm just going to point out a few of the effects that we can see with cortisol. So one of the regions that cortisol can affect is going to be the liver. So when cortisol enters into the liver, the cortisol will go into the cells and cause genomic effects. It will modulate transcription. So what happens is that cortisol will increase the transcription of certain genes, and then these genes will be translated into protein. And the specific genes that the cortisol is going to have effects on are genes that encode for gluconeogenic enzymes and enzymes involved in amino acid metabolism. So in other words, when cortisol enters into the liver, it will increase the transcription of mRNA. The mRNA will then be translated into proteins, which will form gluconeogenic enzymes and enzymes involved in amino acid metabolism. So the effect of cortisol is that it's going to increase the production of glucose by the liver. And it does this by first increasing the synthesis of gluconeogenic enzymes, and secondly, by increasing the synthesis of enzymes involved in amino acid metabolism, which are used to fuel gluconeogenesis. So that one of the effects of cortisol is to increase the production of glucose by the liver. So cortisol can also have effects on muscle. So cortisol can actually increase proteolysis. And remember that proteolysis is the process of hydrolyzing protein into amino acids. These amino acids are then used to fuel gluconeogenesis by the liver. So another thing that cortisol can affect is lipid metabolism. So cortisol is actually going to increase the breakdown of fat into free fatty acids and glycerol. So in other words, cortisol stimulates lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat into free fatty acids and glycerol. The glycerol is going to be used for gluconeogenesis to produce glucose, whereas fatty acids are going to be used to provide an alternative fuel source to glucose. Now it's important to realize that for an unknown reason, fat is going to be mobilized from the extremities, but deposited centrally. So in other words, cortisol causes fat to be lost in the extremities, but it causes fat to be deposited centrally. So the last effect that we're going to look at today is the effect of cortisol on bones. So cortisol is actually going to decrease the ability of osteoblasts to synthesize new bones. And we're going to talk about this later in another video. So that's it for this video. I hope this video helped you understand the cellular signaling pathway of cortisol, and I hoped it also helped you understand some of the effects of cortisol. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.